Welcome back to HuntForge, brothers. Picture the scene. A shooter walks into a gun counter in the spring of 2026. Inside the glass sits a blued Smith & Wesson 6.86 chambered in .357 Magnum, priced at $899. One shelf over sits a heavier, older-looking Smith & Wesson 6.25 wheelgun, chambered in .45 ACP, priced at $1,099. $200 of difference, and 90% of modern shooters will point instinctively at the .357, believing they just walked out with a smarter buy. That instinct was installed by marketing, not by ballistics. That $200 is not a markup. It is the price tag the industry quietly attached to a mechanical truth that has been buried under 60 years of Hollywood mythology and pressed steel snub-nose revolvers sold by the millions to men who did not know what they were paying for. Your grandfather never fired a 125-grain Magnum round out of a 2-inch barrel at 3 a.m. inside his own living room. Your grandfather carried a .45 that had been oiled by his own hands for 20 years, and he carried it because the men who had actually been shot at, the beat cops, the military revolver veterans, the stakeout detectives of the old New York City felony squad, had taught him what a handgun was really for. What the industry buried behind glossy magazine ads and dirty Harry posters is a physics problem any honest ballistician can draw on a napkin in 30 seconds. Today, HuntForge strips the ego off both sides of this debate. No Hollywood, no marketing slogans, just pressure, mass, velocity, steel, and the testimony of men who measured these rounds in laboratories and in gunfights. Sit down, brothers. The myth ends here. The fight between the .357 Magnum and the .45 ACP is, at its core, a fight between two philosophies of terminal ballistics: speed versus mass, shock versus crush. The .357 Magnum is the undisputed champion of the velocity camp. A standard 125-grain factory load exits a 4-inch barrel at over 1,400 feet per second, generating more than 500 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. On paper, the .45 ACP looks anemic beside it, a lazy 230-grain projectile lumbering along at roughly 850 feet per second, barely producing 370 foot-pounds. Every gun magazine for 40 years has pointed at that muzzle energy column and told the reader to choose accordingly. That is the first lie. Dr. Martin Fackler, the United States Army trauma surgeon who ran the Wound Ballistics Laboratory at Letterman Army Institute of Research and founded the International Wound Ballistics Association, spent his professional life dismantling the kinetic energy myth. Using calibrated 10% ordnance gelatin and autopsy records of real gunshot casualties, Fackler demonstrated that handgun bullets, regardless of caliber, cannot generate meaningful hydrostatic shock. Human tissue is extraordinarily elastic. Unless a projectile is moving at rifle velocities above roughly 2,200 feet per second, the temporary stretch cavity that looks so dramatic in ballistic gel simply snaps back into place. It does not shear organs. It is, in Fackler's documented conclusion, almost entirely cosmetic. What kills is the permanent crush cavity, the actual hole, the tissue the bullet physically tears out of the body as it passes through. Now measure the two cartridges against that standard. A .357 Magnum hollow point has a nominal diameter of 357 inches before expansion. A .45 ACP hollow point starts at 452 inches, already nearly half an inch wide before it has done anything. Load a modern bonded defensive round like the Winchester Ranger T-Series or the Federal HST into the .45, and that projectile expands to a full inch in diameter as it crushes through tissue. Load that same Ranger T-Series into the .357, and under ideal conditions, it expands to roughly 65 inches. The gap becomes catastrophic the moment something goes wrong. If a .357 Magnum hollow point strikes heavy winter denim, an insulated jacket, or auto glass, and the cavity plugs with fiber before expansion triggers, that bullet becomes a high-velocity ice pick, punching a 357-inch hole straight through the target. If a .45 ACP fails to expand for the same reason, the target still absorbs a half-inch wide sledgehammer traveling at 900 feet per second. The worst-case scenario for the .45 is still a wide, ugly, permanent wound channel. The worst-case scenario for the .357 is a pinhole at freight train speed. What the industry buried is not that the .357 is weak. It is not weak. What the industry buried is that muzzle energy, the number printed on every ammunition box, is a rifle metric that was borrowed wholesale into the handgun market because it made certain cartridges look better than they actually perform. The honest metric, the one Fackler kept returning to across 3 decades of research, is wound channel volume. On that metric, the heavy, slow, wide .45 ACP wins by geometry alone. Here is where the modern concealed carrier commits the most expensive mistake of his armed life. He walks out of the gun store with a 2-inch .357 Magnum snub-nose, convinced he is carrying the most powerful compact revolver ever made. He is not. He is carrying a beautifully engineered machine designed to punish its user and deceive its owner. To understand why, a man needs to understand the chemistry of Magnum powder. The .357 Magnum was not invented for snub-nose revolvers. It was developed in 1934 and 1935 by the American gun writer Elmer Keith, the ballistician Phil Sharp, and the engineering team at Smith & Wesson under Daniel B. Wesson II, specifically for use in a heavy-frame, long-barrel service revolver. Keith's documented load development work, published in his own writings long before the cartridge entered mass production, was tested almost exclusively in 8 3/8-inch and 6-inch barrels. Phil Sharp's technical notes on the project, later compiled in his Complete Guide to Hand Loading, specified slow-burning powders, the kind that build pressure steadily over a long column of barrel. The legendary 1,400 feet per second velocity is a number that exists only when those slow-burning powders are given the distance they were engineered to use. Cut that barrel down to 2 inches, and the physics collapse. Chronograph data from independent testing, published across decades of hand-loading manuals from Hornady, Speer, and Hodgdon, tells the same story. A 125-grain factory .357 Magnum load that clocks 1,420 feet per second from a 4-inch barrel drops to between 1,050 and 1,150 feet per second in a 2-inch snub. The bullet exits the muzzle long before the powder has finished burning. That unburnt powder detonates in open air, producing a 4-foot fireball that destroys the shooter's night vision, a muzzle blast over 165 decibels that permanently damages unprotected hearing. A revolver is a small pressure vessel designed to contain controlled explosions 6 times per cylinder. Every time that cylinder rotates, the steel is asked to hold back a specific amount of force. Ask it to hold back less, and the gun lasts forever. Ask it to hold back more, and the gun is on a countdown clock from the day it leaves the factory. The Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturers Institute, SAAMI, publishes the industry standard pressure specifications for every commercial cartridge sold in the United States. The .45 ACP is rated at 21,000 pounds per square inch. The .357 Magnum is rated at 35,000 pounds per square inch. The Magnum cartridge operates at roughly 2/3 more chamber pressure than the .45 on every single shot. What happens to the revolver across 10,000 rounds of that difference? 2 things. First, flame cutting. When a revolver fires, a microscopic gap between the front of the cylinder and the rear face of the barrel allows a jet of superheated combustion gas to escape sideways. In a .45 ACP revolver operating at 21,000 psi, that gas is manageable. In a .357 Magnum operating at 35,000 psi, especially with light 110 grain or 125 grain bullets that seat deep and expose more powder to the top strap, that escaping gas acts as a plasma cutting torch. Across several thousand full Magnum rounds, it literally erodes steel from the underside of the top strap directly above the barrel cylinder gap. Second, forcing cone erosion. The forcing cone is the tapered section at the rear of the barrel that funnels the bullet from the cylinder chamber into the bore. In a medium-frame Magnum revolver, the Smith & Wesson K-frame Model 19, for decades the most beloved service revolver in American police history, the forcing cone is relatively thin at its 6 o'clock position. A steady diet of 125-grain Magnum loads, which slam into the forcing cone at peak pressure and peak velocity, causes microfractures that eventually propagate into visible cracks. Smith & Wesson's own engineering response was to phase out the Model 19 as a dedicated Magnum platform and replace it with the heavier L-frame Model 686, which has a thicker forcing cone specifically engineered to survive Magnum pressures. The Model 19 was, in the words of generations of police armorers, a gun the industry marketed as a full-time Magnum when its steel told a different story. Now picture a different scene. A grandfather's gun safe. Inside, wrapped in an oiled cloth that smells of 3-in-1 and old leather, sits a Smith & Wesson Model 62545 ACP revolver that has been fired every other weekend for 30 years. Pull it out, check the lockup, spin the cylinder, look at the forcing cone. It is pristine. The top strap shows no flame cutting. The cylinder timing is as tight as the day it left the factory. That gun has eaten 50,000 rounds of .45 ACP and carries almost no evidence of the conversation. This is what 21,000 psi buys a shooter. A forever gun. The .45 ACP wheelgun is, by the simple mathematics of chamber pressure, one of the most mechanically honest firearms ever built. It outlives its owner. It is handed down. It is the revolver a grandson inherits. What the industry buried is the maintenance reality of the Magnum class. Nobody at the gun counter mentions the forcing cone inspection that a heavy-use .357 Magnum needs every few thousand rounds. Nobody mentions that most of the legendary service revolvers of the 1970s and 1980s, the same guns that built the Magnum mythology, were quietly taken out of police inventory because they could not survive the round they were chambered for. A revolver fight is a math problem. 6 rounds against an unknown number of threats. The speed and reliability of the reload is not a convenience feature. It is the line between fighting back and dying empty. The .357 Magnum is a rimmed cartridge. Rimmed cartridges are native to revolvers. The rim sits on the chamber shoulder, and the extractor star hooks it for ejection. To reload a rimmed revolver under pressure, a shooter uses a speed loader, a plastic or aluminum device that holds 6 loose rounds in cylinder geometry and releases them when a knob or central button is activated. The speed loader is a decent piece of engineering. It is also, under the fine motor skill collapse of a real gunfight, a liability. Every competitive shooter knows that under adrenaline, the hands shake. Fine motor coordination degrades. A shooter who can reload a speed loader in 1.8 seconds on the square range will, under real stress, fumble the alignment, drop the loader, bind the rounds halfway in, and lose 3 to 5 seconds in the process. Worse, when a shooter ejects fired .357 Magnum brass under stress, The expanded case rims can slip over the extractor star instead of under it, trapping spent brass inside the cylinder and turning a fighting revolver into a closed paperweight. The .45 ACP solved this problem by accident in 1917. When the United States entered the First World War, the military had standardized on the 1911 pistol and its .45 ACP cartridge, but Colt and Springfield Armory could not produce 1911s fast enough to arm the American Expeditionary Force. The War Department turned to Smith & Wesson and Colt and asked them to chamber existing large-frame service revolvers in .45 ACP. The problem was immediate. The .45 ACP is rimless. It has no rim for a revolver extractor to grab. Smith & Wesson's engineering solution was the half-moon clip, and shortly after, the full-moon clip, a thin stamped steel disc that snaps into the extractor grooves of 3 or 6 .45 ACP cartridges, holding them together as a single rigid unit. The resulting Model 1917 revolvers from Smith & Wesson and Colt were issued to American troops and saw combat in France under General John Pershing's Expeditionary Command. What began as a wartime workaround accidentally produced the most tactically sophisticated reload system in revolver history. Moon-clipped .45 ACP cartridges reload like a single object. There is no alignment. The short, fat .45 case geometry practically falls into the charge holes on its own. The cylinder closes without resistance, and because every spent case is physically locked to every other spent case by the steel clip, extraction is absolute. One stroke of the ejector rod clears all 6 rounds as a single unit. The extractor star cannot skip behind a case. The brass cannot tilt. The failure mode of the rimmed speed loader does not exist in the moon clip system. Jerry Miculek, the world record-holding competitive revolver shooter from Louisiana, fires 8 shots from a moon-clipped Smith & Wesson 625 on 2 targets in 1.00 seconds flat. A documented world record that has stood for decades. Miculek did not choose the .45 ACP wheelgun because it is marginally faster than a .357 speedloader. He chose it because it is mechanically incapable of the failure modes that will cost a man his life. The honest caveat, because HuntForge does not sell half the truth, is that moon clips are delicate. A bent moon clip will prevent a cylinder from closing, and the warped clip carried loose in a pocket can render a defensive revolver useless. Moon clips belong in a dedicated pouch, and a shooter who carries a .45 ACP wheelgun for defense must treat his clips the way a rifleman treats his magazines. That is the price of admission. It is also the only price. Muzzle energy on a ballistic chart means nothing if the bullet does not hit the target. Every man who has ever studied the anatomy of real gunfights understands this. Jim Cirillo, the New York City Police Department stakeout squad detective who survived more than a dozen documented armed confrontations in the 1960s and 1970s, and later wrote the foundational text, Guns, Bullets, and Gunfights, returned again and again to the same observation. The caliber that ends a fight is the caliber the shooter can actually control under extreme stress. Cirillo was a .38 Special and .45 ACP man. He had access to every service caliber in the NYPD arsenal, and he chose the rounds he could place accurately over the rounds that looked more impressive on paper. His logic was purely empirical. He had watched fellow officers miss with Magnum-class revolvers at arm's length because the recoil and muzzle blast had broken their concentration before the trigger broke the sear. The recoil impulse of a full-house .357 Magnum, fired from a medium-frame revolver, is a violent, high-frequency, high-pressure snap. It is not a push, it is a strike. It cracks into the palm of the hand and the wrist joints like a small hammer. For shooters over the age of 60, for shooters with any form of arthritis, for women and smaller-framed men, And for anyone whose grip strength has ever been compromised by injury, the .357 Magnum is a physically punishing cartridge to shoot at volume. The body learns quickly. It begins to anticipate the pain. It flinches. The eyes close a fraction of a second before the trigger breaks. The muzzle dips. The shot lands low and left. This is not a failure of the shooter. It is a normal biological response to a cartridge operating near the upper edge of what a human hand was designed to absorb. The .45 ACP recoil impulse is fundamentally different. It is slow. It is heavy. It is a push, not a strike. Colonel Jeff Cooper, HuntForge, does not tell half the story. The .357 Magnum is not obsolete. The .357 Magnum, used correctly in the barrel length and environment for which Elmer Keith and Phil Sharp originally engineered it, is still one of the most versatile defensive cartridges in the world. Two domains belong to it absolutely. The first is versatility. A .357 Magnum revolver chambers and fires the .38 Special interchangeably. The .38 is simply a shorter version of the same case. This means one firearm becomes two. A shooter can run hundreds of rounds of inexpensive, low recoil, low blast .38 Special for fundamental marksmanship training, then load full house Magnum ammunition for duty carry. This is a practical advantage the .45 ACP wheelgun does not offer. The .45 is a single-purpose cartridge, and its owner is married to the 230-grain impulse every time the trigger breaks. The second domain is the wilderness. Outside the urban context, where barrier penetration and sectional density become critical, the .357 Magnum reclaims its throne. Fired from a 4-inch or 6-inch barrel, the barrel lengths the cartridge was designed for, the .357 Magnum shoots exceptionally flat, retains its velocity over distance, and possesses the sectional density necessary to punch through heavy bone, thick muscle, and the tough hide of feral hog, coyote, black bear, and medium-sized game. Bill Jordan, the United States Border Patrol officer who spent 30 years on the Texas-Mexico line and authored the classic instructional text, "No Second Place Winner," carried a Smith & Wesson Model 19.357 Magnum throughout his career. Jordan survived multiple gunfights using the cartridge. His documented position, expressed across his writings and his firearms instruction, was that the .357 Magnum, used in a 4-inch service barrel against human threats and wilderness predators at extended distances, was the most useful cartridge a man could carry in the field. Jordan was not wrong.